So let's take a look at some of the things I learned from Dr. Deming and see if that helps us. Dr. Deming used to say at his 4-day seminars, he used to ask, why are we here? And the answer is to have fun, to learn, and to make a difference. So hopefully we can get some of that to happen today. By the way, when Dr. Deming talks about learning and we're talking about understanding what's going on, he used to say over and over again, there's no substitute for knowledge. And knowledge comes and learning comes from rigorous paying attention to what's going on. And by the way, quality depends on knowledge. Lack of knowledge will lead you to all kinds of disasters. So what we're looking for is knowledge. And if you're having fun, you're likely to learn more, and that's useful. And then the next step is to move on to making a difference with what you've learned. People used to say when we had our end-to-end conferences that, well, you're trying to change the way we think. And I would explain over and over again, you think fine. All I want to do is make you aware of your thinking and how to use it to your advantage. Dr. Deming gave us a system of profound knowledge, and we're going to talk in more detail about appreciation for a system and theory of knowledge. But what he offered that the system of knowledge is going to allow us to do, it's a lens through which we can view the organization. And he said the various portions of this system, because it's a system, interact with each other. And so knowledge about appreciation for a system or understanding variation is incomplete without knowledge about psychology and without a way to generate new knowledge. And so that interdependency is a critical element of a system. Dr. Deming offered us that we need theory in order to learn. And an example of that he used with Chanticleer the rooster, who crowed every morning and believed that his theory was that his crowing caused the sun to rise. Then one morning he overslept, and when he woke up, the sun was up. So now he had learned something. And his theory was in need of revision. And what Deming offered is, without a theory, he would have learned nothing. He would have not had a way to create that new knowledge that his crowing wasn't the cause of the sun coming up. So Dr. Deming talked about appreciation for a system, and Russ Akoff, who's a systems guru, if you will, used to remind us that the purpose of a for-profit company is not to make a profit. Russ offered profit is a necessary condition for survival, but it's not a purpose. And Dr. Deming reminded us that every man-made system has a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, it's not a system. If you look at a human being, think about what Russ was saying, that there are necessary conditions for survival, and there's a purpose, and those things are different. A person will breathe air in and exhale, but his purpose is not breathing air in and exhaling. His purpose lies somewhere else. Breathing in and breathing out is a necessary condition for survival, but it's not his purpose. Nobody would make a mistake of thinking my purpose on earth is to breathe, but there are a lot of people who think the purpose of a profit-making company is to make a profit. And Russ Akoff offered us, we also have this perception that growth is what we're after in a company or an organization. We want to grow. And Russ said, that's different from development. And he offered that garbage heaps grow, they don't develop. And he said, I quit growing years ago, but I am continuing to develop. So what we're looking for is development in an organization. Development of its employees, development of products, development of infrastructure, development of relationships with its suppliers, developing an infrastructure, a market, developing especially employees, and developing an environment where employees have a chance to take joy in their work and pride in learning. So if we look at what is a system is a pattern, and it's a pattern of interdependencies. And interdependencies are different from dependencies. An interdependency means what happens in one place affects the other place, and what's happening in that other place affects the one place. Like a human body. It's interdependent. Your lungs, your muscles, and your heart are interdependent. When you're running around, what's going on in your body, in your lungs, depends on what's going on in your muscles running around and what's going on in your heart. And what's going on in your heart depends on what's going on in your muscles and in your lungs. And those interdependencies are critical in paying attention to and managing the organization. Dr. Deming had what he calls production viewed as a system. And it doesn't have to be production, it could be a service. But the idea is that you have an organization that is a system. It has a purpose, an aim. And in order to achieve that aim, you have created some interdependencies. In this case, you have a stage zero where an idea gets generated. You need a design. If it's a change to an existing idea, it's redesign. Then you have suppliers of materials and equipment. You receive and test things. A, B, and C are suppliers. You produce, assemble, and inspect, and you support that with tests of processes and machines and methods. You distribute it. You get it to consumers. You may do some customer research, and then you're back in to designing and redesigning based on what's going on. And this looks like a very simple diagram, and Deming claims it's what he had on the board in all his meetings with Japan, and it's what allowed them to move from where they were to, in essence, burying the auto industry in the United States and Detroit in about a decade and a half. And it's a simple chart, but it's not all that easy to understand. Even when you draw the picture and you look at it, if I point to a place on the chart, for example, production, and we're in a room full of people, and I assign them bases in design and suppliers and materials so they all know what sequence they're in, and ask them, if you're downstream of production, raise your hand. And it's very rare, if I've seen it at all, that everybody in the room raises his or her hand. And that means we don't understand the diagram. It's a system. And so everything is downstream of everything else, which means it has interdependencies. And what happens in one place affects what happens elsewhere. And what happens elsewhere affects what happens in that place. And in order to assure that the system gets better, what you need to do is recognize that the place where the problem shows up may have nothing to do with what caused the problem. For example, if you're feeling your pulse at the wrist and you find your pulse is 100, and you don't say, "Oh my gosh, what's the matter with my wrist?" You recognize that your body's a system, and that's a signal that something's wrong somewhere in the system. We don't necessarily have that understanding when we look at our corporations. In addition, if you take a look at production viewed as a system, and you're in production, where I've got it circled there, because of the way we organize things, if you want to make an improvement, and you're manager of production and you have a budget to deal with, where do you look for the return on investment that you make in trying to make an improvement? And typically, the manager of production is going to look for the return on investment in production. And the difficulty with that, as Russ Akoff pointed out, is that's trying to improve the system by improving the parts separately. So a system's performance is not the sum of the product of what's produced by each of the parts. It's a product of their interaction. And what's important about what Russ said is it's not a sum, which is one thing, that's addition. And the second thing is it's a product, it's a multiplication. And the multiplying effect is critical. Unfortunately, our mental model of how we deal with things that are complex, like an organization, the prevailing style of management, we divide it up into chunks. So we've got all these chunks, and then we work on attempting to improve the chunks separately. And the unfortunate thing about that is not only does it not improve the performance of the system, it can destroy the system entirely. You can improve one part of it, and because of that improvement, it fouls everything else up. We had an example of that where we used to make a part that's got a disc, so it's a circle, and then it's got blades that go around the outside of it. And the blades have variation in their width, and there's variation in the diameter of the parts. When we instituted continuous improvement, every little department had to go off and make an improvement. The people that make the blades had an assignment, and they went off and made an improvement of blades. What was happening is the blades had variation in width. And so from their perspective, reducing that variation was going to be an improvement. So they set to work on that. What they didn't know is that the way the guys in assembly handled things is they got those blades, and before they had to weld them onto the disc, they stack them up around and make sure there were no gaps and no overlaps of the blades. And then they'd weld them together. And because there was variation in the blades and some variation in the wheel diameter, they would stack them up. And if there was a gap at the top, they'd exchange blades that they had and take some of them out, put in different ones until they got no gaps and no overlap. When the blade guys were done with their improvement activity, they sent their first lot of blades down to the shop floor, and those widths of the blades were nearly identical. So when the guys stacked the blades up around the outside of the disc, they found a gap. And because all the blades were nearly the same size, no amount of changing blades was going to eliminate that gap. So because we improved the blades, reduced the variation on the blades, we were unable to assemble the product. So we improved a piece and destroyed the system. So what we have to remember, and that's part of our thinking, is when we look at something, it's not just a part, it's a part of something. And the of is important. That's what makes the system. Everything's part of something else. If you take a look at what we've got going on here, you can see that breaking things down into pieces and working on the pieces separately, as Deming pointed out, is likely to be a mistake. And as Russ pointed out, is not how you improve a system. And just to give you an idea, when you break things down into pieces, like an organization into individuals, and improve the individuals separately, if we've got A plus B plus C plus D plus E, F, G, all those individuals, there are not very many individuals compared to the number of interactions. There are interactions 2 by 2, A, B, A, C, A, D. There are interactions 3 by 3. There are interactions 4 by 4, 5 by 5. And what Dr. Deming pointed out to us is an interaction could be negative, 0, or positive. And if you're working on improving the individuals, first of all, there's not much leverage in making an individual better if indeed the interactions between the individuals is not very good. You're better off focusing on the interactions and the interdependencies and trying to improve those. People over the years have mistaken what Dr. Deming said in one of his 14 points, where he said, we need to improve constantly and forever the systems of production and services, the systems, not the individual pieces. It's not about improving individual pieces. It's about improving the performance of the system, which we do by improving the performance of not the parts individually, but their interactions and their interdependencies. And in order to do any of that, you have to have knowledge. You have to learn. And I've discovered something. It took me a while. When I was reading Dr. Deming, he had a plan, do, study, act cycle, which was interesting to me. And so I was looking at the plan, do, study, act cycle, and I had used it for trying to make improvements. And while I was successful to some extent in doing that, something I hadn't recognized hit me about 15 years into using the system. It had to do with recognizing what the title Deming used for Plan, Do, Study, Act. Plan, Do, Study, Act is different from Plan, Do, Check, Act. Plan, Do, Check, Act is something I've seen employed in program management, where you set a goal, that's the planning. The doing is you do the activity, and the check, is checking to see if you met your goal. And Dr. Deming said that's insufficient, and it doesn't meet his intent. And he claims that he got this way of approaching things from Dr. Schuhart, so he calls it the Schuhart cycle. What it took me 15 years to recognize that Deming calls it the Schuhart cycle for learning. You can't make an improvement if you haven't learned something about your organization and how it functions. It's necessary to learn. And this chart is not only for improvement, it's fundamental for learning. I watched Brendan when he was growing up trying to do skateboard tricks, and he used this cycle. Deming pointed out, this is how everything happens. You have a theory. Brendan had a theory on how to do a skateboard trick. So then he had a plan. He plans on how he's going to execute it. Then he tries the execution. That's the doing function. And he got feedback, and some of the feedback was painful. So he studied the results of what he was doing, and as watching him, you could see him checking out in his head, deciding whether things were working the way they wanted to, or whether he needed to change things, or whether he needed to abandon his plan and say, this theory is no good. What Dr. Deming and Dr. Schuhart pointed out is the way to learn is to have a theory and compare it to reality. Like the rooster, he had a theory and had been comparing it to reality. When the reality turned out not to be supported, his theory not to be supported by reality, he had a chance to learn and change his theory. So when people talk about being too theoretical, there's no such thing as being too theoretical. If you have a theory and you have a way demonstrating the usefulness of the theory, the plan, do, study, act cycle can help with that. In fact, it is fundamental to how we learn. And Deming pointed out that we try to learn from data. The unfortunate thing is we have all this data laying around in organizations, and we think because we have this data, by examining the data, somehow we're going to learn something. But as Deming points out, you don't even know what data to collect unless you have a theory. So you need to understand, what is it am I trying to learn? And once you understand what you're trying to learn, you have a chance of identifying a plan, a way of validating your theory, and a way of knowing what data you need to collect in order to validate that theory. So this is fundamental not only for innovation and improvement, but it's learning. It's how we learn. We learn by comparing theory, and experience alone teaches us nothing. Theory alone teaches us nothing. We need to make the comparison. And sometimes data is useful. Although Dr. Deming cautioned us, the most important figures, numbers, data that you need for managing an organization are unknown and unknowable. So you need to manage them anyway. For example, the cost of one unhappy customer. You don't know the cost. You can't measure the cost, but you have to manage what's happening when you have an unhappy customer. Also, he pointed out that management doesn't recognize how it thinks. For example, they don't recognize that when they're working to make an improvement, that focusing on the individual part without seeing how it interacts with the rest of the system is going to lead them to trouble. In fact, Deming pointed out that if you try to manage your organization by figures alone, you're soon going to be without figures and without an organization. And the example he used is management believes, has a theory. They don't like to call it a theory because they think theories are not useful, but they're a necessary condition for learning. Their theory is that by training the people that work for them, they're going to get better products and better services out of the system that those people are performing in. So they invest in training, and the training costs show up on the books. So there are figures for training costs. What doesn't show up in the books anywhere is the benefit. Where can they measure the benefit of the training? There is no number that shows them the benefit of training, and yet they continue to train. And Deming praises them and says, they are managing out of theory. Their theory is that we're going to be better off if people are trained. So we're training people. It costs money, and the benefit is unknown and unknowable. And yet they continue to manage by using training. that's an important thing we need to learn to do. So learning and improvement, and learning comes from knowledge. And I'm going to give an example of Peaker Services. Dick Steele founded Peaker Services in 1971, and they, at the time, worked on big diesel engines for locomotives. And they've expanded and gotten into other things over the years. But sometime in the 70s, he got acquainted with Dr. Deming's work, and he decided he wanted to transform Peaker Services into a Deming company. And so he started on that journey, and that journey involved continually learning. And Dick, over the years, has pointed out that people mistake some of what Deming is talking about. When you ask somebody, oh, concisely, tell me what Dr. Deming's ideas are about, and they say they're about quality, and they're about statistical control, and they're about numbers. And Dick pointed out that Deming's work is about knowledge. His idea is Deming wants to create knowledge. And what Dick found out in trying to transform Peaker Services, how much learning has to take place, and it's continual and continuing to improve the system. He eventually got, 12 years ago maybe. So he'd been running the company for nearly 40 years, and he decided that he was going to bail out as the head honcho. But before he decided to leave the organization, he asked the employees if they would like to buy the company from him, and he would loan them the money, and they could become an employee-operated organization. And they agreed they wanted to do that, so he helped transform the organization. But in order to do that, he knew he was going to need somebody who understood Dr. Deming. So he hired Ian Bradbury to run the organization, and Dick remained on the board of directors. And they employed, over the years, something that Associates in Process Improvement, API, calls business as a quality as a business strategy. So every system has a purpose, and you've got a system that gets information on what customers are interested in and wanting, and you've got objectives that you've planned. And if you see in this chart, organization viewed as a system, this is the API version of Dr. Deming's work. And over here, API's plan, do, study, plan, do, study cycle. And what's important about that is that's key into learning whatever you're going to learn about improving the system. And as a learning cycle, what you have to ask yourself before you get started is, what are you trying to learn? What is your theory that you want to test? How is it going to make the system better? How will you know it made the system better? And so this quality as a business strategy is a methodology for doing that. And Dick and his cohorts employed that over the years, and it involves interactions in what's going on. And their purpose and mission, they challenged every year to see if they should be have a different mission or purpose or system. And it changed probably 6 times over the years, partly because business changed. Now, this continued changing involves, one of the things Deming pointed out is the system involves the future. And in order for you to be around in the future, you're going to have to innovate and improve. Because if you don't, what you're going to find out is you are the manufacturer and producer of the highest quality, lowest cost buggy whip in the world. But nobody needs buggy whips anymore, so you're out of business. Looking to the future, and as Russ pointed out, the future involves development. You need to develop new products, new services. And because you have a system, and everybody in the system, and that's what happened at Peaker, 95 people, all understood the purpose of the organization, understood how they fit into that purpose. And Dick had created an environment where everybody's ideas were important and were put to use when they would improve the system. In fact, it got to the point where he developed a way that anybody anywhere on the shop floor, in the executive office and management, if they came up with a theory, an idea of what might improve the system, since they were familiar with what the system was, how they fit in, what they proposed might get done, the new idea might happen, they could do a plan, do, study, act cycle. When you do a plan, do, study, act cycle, it might cost some investment money. You might have to buy some things, or you might have to expend some resources. And Dick arranged that, I think it was, I don't know what it was in the beginning, but I think at one time it was $1,500. You could spend $1,500 in company money to test your theory without having to get permission from anybody in management. No matter where you were in the organization, ideas, innovations, knowledge, new ways of doing things, new methods, new products can come from anywhere in the organization. Anywhere in that production viewed as a system can be a source. And that source, if we're going to take advantage of the knowledge of that source, we have to have the people that work in the system knowledgeable about how they fit into the system, knowledgeable about what the system is, recognize some interactions and interdependencies, and be able to use the plan, do, study, act cycle. And so Beaker Services is still going strong after all these years, including some rather nasty times, and they are going. And quality as a business strategy was part of what made them successful. That part included Dick's understanding of Dr. Deming's work, combining it, API. That we were unable to generate any other way, and those were effective And the lateral thinking process, especially random word, does not take a long time and can lead to all kinds of neat ideas that you never thought of before. Six Thinking Hats was also useful. It can be an examination of what's going on. It can lead you to other things. So both these books are authored by Edward de Bono, and I can tell you that I have used them and they have been very effective at helping us improve things. And with that, Chris, I think maybe it's time for some questions and maybe I'll have some answers.
No problem, Tim. Again, thank you for that presentation. I think it was very insightful indeed. So let me go to the Q&A and see what we have. So the first question I'll take actually is one question coming from an anonymous attendee regarding PDSA. So in their opinion, PDSA focuses on small scale and usually a process level. However, you specify that Dr. Deming principles focuses on system thinking, appreciation for a system, which goes a little bit beyond system thinking, but system thinking for the question, not individual parts. Isn't that contradictory, or is improving individual parts eventually improves the system in terms of a theory of constraints?
One of the interesting things is Dr. Deming pointed out, I think it was Peter Schultes who pointed it out to me, that Dr. Deming's production viewed as a system is a plan, do, study, act cycle. You generate an idea for a product or a service that would help somebody and enjoy a good and sustainable market. You create a design and you get suppliers of materials and you produce the design, you distribute it, and you get feedback from the customer. The plan stage, the theory is in the stage zero. When you come up with the idea, you have a theory. Then you design, produce, and try to sell that product. That doing offers you an opportunity to test your theory. Can this product enjoy a good and sustainable market? And the answer may be no, it may be yes, and there may be ways to improve it. So production viewed as a system in and of itself is a plan, do, study, act cycle. And you can apply it at that level, or you can apply it at individual levels, because the cycle, while it looks like a cycle and it talks about improvement, the improvement comes from knowledge. And plan, do, study, act generates knowledge that didn't exist before. That's the point of plan, do, study, act. And that knowledge can be about a process or a part of the system, or it can be about the system as a whole. In fact, one of the important things to do as a manager of an organization is to understand better and better the interactions among the parts of your system. And plan, do, study, act can help with that. Dick Steele and Peaker Services is an example of that.
And I think it's also important, again, to not miss the importance of interactions. Quite often, a lot of us think that we are actually implementing Deming or implementing PDSAs, but are actually doing so within a theory of a prevailing style of management, focus on the parts and not focus on the interactions. So quite often when you're implementing a PDSA in the Deming lens, it requires you to involve much more persons than in your own department or in your own neck of the woods in order to look at the implication and look at the interactions and so on. So again, it's across the entire system. So that too, I think, is also very important to know.
One of the things Dick Steele pointed out to me in using this at Peaker Services is in the study step, Dr. Deming is not asking you just to check whether your results match your theory. He wants you to study what energy it took to create this plan and to create and to execute it. And what did you learn in executing the plan? And what did you learn about your theory? So that learning helps you do a better plan, do, study, act the next time around, and might even generate new ideas for plan, do, study, act activities. And when you use production as a system and plan, do, study, act together, yes, you can do it piecemeal and learn some things, but the important thing is improving the system as a whole. And so if the improvement you make only improves something in a local area, you haven't made much gain. What you're looking for is an improvement of the interactions between people, departments, pieces of the equipment, whatever it is.
So again, I know that for businesses which use the PDCA, how easy would it be to shift to PDSA operationally? Any tips or insights in terms of examining the concept on a whole?
Yeah, the first step, as Deming talked about, is you have to transform the organization. Transform it, as he said, involves transforming the individuals, but the individuals being transformed does not change the organization. Management has to get involved. So what needs to happen is we have to help people understand the purpose of the organization they're working in and how they fit in. That's supposed to be management's job. Unfortunately, management doesn't recognize that its job. So you've got to start with helping people understand the organization as a whole and how they fit in. What they do matters, and how what they do affects what goes on in the rest of the organization. And then help them see, as Deming said, if you're looking at profound knowledge, help them appreciate systems, that things are interdependent, not just independent. Have a method for learning new things about the system. PDSA is a great method. They have to understand variation. We didn't talk about variation, but there are two kinds of variation, and you need to understand the distinction between common cause variation, stuff that's inherent in the system, and special cause variation. And Deming says, especially, you have to understand that in managing people, and that's the psychology part of it. So we too often believe that the output of the system is really based on an individual. We prove that every year because we break the employees down one by one, and we do an analysis of what they tried to do that year and how well that worked out individually. We don't look at how they work with each other, and we don't reward them for working with each other. We reward them for individual efforts and individual greatness. There's a difference between teamwork in a Deming organization and teamwork in other organizations. In a Deming organization, teamwork means, what can I do that helps other people do their jobs better? In a prevailing style of management organization, teamwork means each of us does his job as best we can, regardless of what the heck anybody else is. So there's a difference. The word is still teamwork, but there's a very big difference. In a Deming organization, your job is to help make the system better, which might mean the production guy is going to spend $10,000 of his money to help the inspection people, which is another department. That rarely happens in corporations today.
So you're talking about working together versus working together separately.
Exactly.
Another question we have here. So the PDSA, the first step is planning. What is the role of quality planning in all of these? The company departments typically works in silos and won't see the benefits, including training, because they don't even have a quality planning in place. With quality planning, there will be requirements on how to measure training benefits. Some companies use product planning, but not company-wide quality planning, which includes finance. What are your thoughts on this perspective in terms of?
Certainly, as Deming pointed out, that management is about prediction. And with predictions, they can be wrong, but it's about predictions. It's not about control. And if you make a prediction, that's a theory. The prediction is a theory. So if you have a prediction that in the parking lot in the summertime in Los Angeles, it's likely to be over 100 degrees, you can't control that, but you can manage to stay out of the parking lot or manage to protect yourself when you're out in the parking lot because it's 101 degrees. So you need a plan to protect yourself, that's for sure, but you need a theory to start with to say, what is the prediction? And if I want that prediction to come true, what should I do? So that's part of the planning. But in response to the idea that you want to engage in a PDSA cycle, the first step is, what am I trying to improve? What am I trying to do? And that requires you to have a theory, a prediction. You have to make a prediction. I believe if I do, this is going to happen. And then the idea is, in the planning stage, is to figure out how you're going to gain the experience so you can compare your theory to what actually happens. So it's a different kind of planning. It's planning your check of your theory. So yes, quality planning and Dick Steele and API with quality as a business strategy. Yes, part of that is very deeply involved in planning. And the interesting thing is, you can't plan on making an improvement because you don't know if what you're going to do makes an improvement. I used to have executives when I was in the continuous improvement office say, if we spend this money, are you going to guarantee we're going to get an improvement? Because we're spending $8,000. I don't want to see if we get $8,000 back. And I said, I can't guarantee an improvement. I can guarantee that we're going to learn something. We're going to spend $8,000 to do a plan, do, study, act cycle, and we will learn something. That something may be that our theory sucks and we have to abandon it and find a better one. Or it may be, hey, this is a great idea. Or maybe if we change it a little, it might be a great idea. I can guarantee learning. I can't guarantee that you're going to get the outcome you want.